I was halfway through fixing the latch on my dog Kennels when I saw her Margery, the HOA president from hell. She marched down the sidewalk like she owned the entire block, clipboard clutched in her bony fingers, her eyes locked onto my backyard like a hawk spotting prey. I already knew this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. It never was with Margery. Ever since I moved in, she and her little HOA cronies had been trying to make my life miserable. First, it was my truck being too large for the driveway. Then, it was my fence being an unauthorized color, even though it was the exact shade the previous owner had. Now, apparently my dog Kennels were the latest target. She came to a stop just outside my gate, her lips pursed so tightly they practically disappeared. "Quentin, we need to talk," she said, tapping her clipboard. I sighed, wiping my hands on my jeans. "What now, Margery?" she huffed. "Your dog kennels are in violation of HOA regulations. They're an eyesore and a noise nuisance. The board has decided they need to be removed immediately." I crossed my arms. "Oh, really? Funny how no one had a problem with them until now." She gave me the kind of fake, tight-lipped smile that made my skin crawl. "The board has received numerous complaints," I cut her off. "From who? Because my neighbors love my dogs. Half of them bring their kids over just to play with them." Margery's eye twitched. "That's beside the point. The kennels must be gone by the end of the week or you'll be fined." I let out a short laugh. "You do remember the court order, don't you?" Her fake smile vanished. Oh, she remembered all right. A few months back, I had taken the HOA to court after they tried to fine me over nonsense. The judge had ruled in my favor and slapped the entire board with an order barring them from harassing me with bogus violations. Margery hated that. She acted like it was some personal attack on her authority. "You think that piece of paper protects you forever?" she snapped. "Rules are still rules, Quentin." I shook my head. "No, Margery, what the court order does is prevent you from pulling stunts like this. If you try to fine me again, you'll be in violation of it, and I will take you right back to court." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly trying to come up with some kind of retort. But before she could, my Great Dane, Duke, let out a deep, rumbling bark from inside one of the kennels. Margery flinched. "Those animals are a menace." "They're well trained, Margery." I gestured to Duke, who was watching her with mild interest. "Unlike some people, they know how to respect boundaries." She let out an angry huff. "We'll see about that," she muttered before storming off. I watched her go, knowing this wasn't over. Margery wasn't the type to let things go. She was the type to escalate. And I had a bad feeling about what was coming next. Margery's retreat didn't bring me any relief. If anything, it put me more on edge. That woman wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to take a loss as a personal insult and retaliate like a cornered animal. I had no doubt she was already scheming her next move. I didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Duke growling low in his throat. That wasn't unusual. He was protective, especially when unfamiliar people lingered too close to the property. But when I stepped outside to check, I found something that made my blood boil. A thick, rusted chain had been wrapped around the gates of my dog Kennels, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. Margery had gone too far. I knelt, pressing my hand against Duke's side to keep him calm while I inspected the lock. The chain was tight, preventing the kennel doors from opening fully. Duke could squeeze out if I forced it, but my other dogs, 2 German Shepherds and a Labrador, would struggle. I stood, jaw tightening. There was no doubt in my mind who had done this. Margery had escalated from threats to outright tampering with my property. That wasn't just an HOA overreach, it was illegal. I took a deep breath, forcing my anger down. Losing my temper wouldn't help. I needed proof. Pulling out my phone, I checked the security camera feed from the night before. Sure enough, around 3 in the morning, Margery's unmistakable figure appeared on the footage. She had crept into my yard, chain in hand, looping it through the kennels and snapping the padlock shut. Then she had stood back, admiring her handiwork like some kind of deranged artist. That was all I needed. I wasted no time. I called the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation. The dispatcher assured me an officer would be sent over shortly. While I waited, I grabbed my bolt cutters from the garage. With a quick snap, the chain fell away. Duke bounded out first, stretching his legs. My other dogs followed, tails wagging, oblivious to the drama. By the time the police cruiser rolled up, I was leaning against the fence, arms crossed. The officer, a stocky man with sharp eyes, stepped out, taking in the broken chain at my feet. I handed over my phone. "I've got her on camera." He watched the footage, his expression hardening. "That's trespassing and vandalism at the very least," I nodded. "And given that she deliberately locked up my dogs, I'd argue it's also animal endangerment." The officer exhaled sharply. "You pressing charges?" I didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely." Margery had spent months making my life miserable, throwing around her so-called authority. Now she had crossed the line into criminal activity. The officer took my statement, then drove off to have a little chat with Margery. I didn't expect her to go quietly. Less than an hour later, I heard shouting down the street. Curious, I walked to the sidewalk, watching as the officer stood on Margery's porch, arms crossed, while she gestured wildly, her voice rising with every word. Ridiculous. I was merely ensuring compliance with HOA regulations. "That man keeps violating our community standards." The officer didn't look impressed. "Ma'am, you illegally entered his property and tampered with his kennels. This isn't an HOA matter, it's a criminal one." Margery's face contorted with outrage. "You don't understand. As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce." The officer cut her off. "No, you don't. Especially not when there's a court order prohibiting you from harassing him." Her mouth snapped shut at that. I could see the realization dawning in her eyes she had gone too far this time. The officer handed her a citation. "You'll be receiving a summons. I suggest you get a lawyer." Margery's hands trembled as she snatched the paper from him. Her glare found me down the street, burning with a fury that could have set fire to my lawn. I simply gave her a slow nod. This wasn't over for her, but for me, it was the beginning of the end of her reign. The fallout from Margery's little stunt spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew about the police visit, the citation, and the fact that she had been caught on camera trespassing and tampering with my kennels. I could see the shift happening in real time. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to challenge her started whispering in clusters by their mailboxes, exchanging knowing glances whenever she passed. Some of them even nodded at me in quiet solidarity, a stark contrast to the wary distance they'd kept before. Margery, on the other hand, was unraveling. She had always carried herself with an air of self-importance, chin lifted like she was royalty addressing peasants. But now, she looked downright frazzled. She stormed up and down the street that afternoon, clipboard in hand, stopping at random houses and gesturing wildly as she spoke. I didn't have to hear her to know what she was doing, trying to salvage her standing, spinning some ridiculous narrative to make herself the victim. It wasn't working. I watched from my porch as my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Donahue, an elderly woman with no patience for nonsense, shut her door in Margery's face without so much as a word. A few houses down, the Petersons, a quiet couple who had always been neutral, shook their heads at whatever she was saying and walked away. She was losing control, but I knew Margery well enough to understand that she wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, an email from the HOA board landed in my inbox. It was a formal notice stating that, despite my recent legal actions, I was still subject to community standards, and that the board was holding a mandatory meeting to discuss ongoing violations. They thought they could intimidate me. I took my time reading the email, letting my irritation settle into something sharper. They wanted a fight. Fine. I was more than ready. When I arrived at the community center for the meeting, I wasn't surprised to see that Margery had packed the room with her most loyal supporters. The usual suspects were there, people who thrived under her rule, the ones who benefited from her selective enforcement of rules. But what did surprise me was how many other residents had shown up. People who normally avoided these meetings, people who had been silently enduring her nonsense for years. They filled the back rows, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Margery wasted no time launching into her theatrics. She stood at the front of the room, clutching a stack of papers like they were some sacred text. "This community has rules for a reason," she declared. "And certain individuals, her eyes locked onto mine, seem to think they are exempt." I leaned back in my seat, letting her dig her own grave. She went on, listing every so-called violation she could throw at me. My truck, my fence, my kennels. She even attempted to claim my security cameras were an invasion of privacy. The irony was almost laughable. When she finally finished her tirade, I stood. "I'd like to remind everyone here that Margery is currently facing criminal charges for trespassing and vandalizing my property," I said. "And yet, here she is, acting like I'm the problem." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margery's face twisted. "That has nothing to do with. It has everything to do with this," I cut her off. "You've been targeting me for months, fabricating violations, trying to bully me into submission, and now that you've finally been caught, you're scrambling to cover it up." Silence stretched in the room. Then, from the back, someone spoke. "I got a fine last week for having a potted plant in my driveway," Mr. Thompson said, arms crossed. "But I've seen others with the same thing and nothing happens to them." "She fined me for excessive lawn decorations because I put out Halloween lights," Mrs. Peterson added. More voices joined in. One by one, people started sharing their own experiences: unfair fines, selective enforcement, threats. Margery's loyal supporters shifted uncomfortably as the mood in the room changed. I pulled out my phone. "I have the court order right here," I said. "It specifically prohibits Margery and this board from targeting me with bogus violations. Any further attempts to do so will result in legal action." I turned to the other residents. "And if any of you have been unfairly fined, I suggest you start documenting everything, because this isn't just about me, it's about all of us." Margery's face was a mask of fury. But for the first time, she wasn't in control. The crowd had turned, and I knew without a doubt that her reign was coming to an end. Margery's grip on the HOA was slipping, and she knew it. The moment the meeting ended, she bolted from the room, her face tight with rage. But the damage was done. The residents had seen her for what she was: a tyrant who used the HOA as her personal tool for control. The next few days were tense. I fully expected some desperate attempt at damage control, but Margery was unusually quiet. No passive-aggressive flyers appeared on my doorstep. No sudden violation notices showed up in my mailbox. It was almost eerie. Then, on the third morning, the retaliation came. I was hauling a bag of dog food into the garage when I heard the sound of an engine idling out front. Stepping onto my driveway, I spotted a tow truck parked near my truck. Two men stood beside it, one holding a clipboard while the other inspected my vehicle. I clenched my jaw. Margery was pulling something new. The clipboard guy turned as I approached, his expression neutral. He had the look of someone just doing his job, but I wasn't about to let them get away with it. "Something I can help you with?" I asked. The man glanced at his clipboard. "We received an order to tow this vehicle. It's been reported as being in violation of HOA regulations." I exhaled sharply. "Let me guess Margery sent you." The second man, still inspecting the truck, frowned. "You saying this is a mistake?" I folded my arms. "I'm saying this is illegal. I have a court order that prevents the HOA from harassing me with bogus violations. And believe me, this is exactly that." Clipboard guy hesitated. "We were told this vehicle was improperly parked and had outstanding fines attached to it." I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "That's impressive, considering I haven't been fined for anything. You got paperwork proving otherwise." The man flipped through his clipboard but didn't respond. I took out my phone and pulled up the security footage app. With a few taps, I rewound to earlier that morning. Sure enough, Margery had been skulking around my driveway, snapping photos of my truck. She must have fabricated a violation and called in the tow company before I could even react. I turned the screen toward the men. See that? That's your client, trespassing on my property to set this up. You still want to tow my truck, or do you want to avoid getting dragged into a lawsuit? Clipboard guy exchanged a glance with his partner. Then, without another word, they backed off. Sorry for the trouble, the second man muttered before they climbed back into their truck and drove off. I wasn't surprised. Most people weren't willing to go down with Margery's sinking ship. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Later that afternoon, I paid a visit to the HOA office. The place was nearly empty, save for a single board member, a wiry man named Greg, who had always seemed more like a reluctant participant in Margery's schemes than an active supporter. He looked up as I stepped inside, his expression wary. "You here to yell at me?" he asked, half joking. I shook my head. "Not unless you had something to do with Margery trying to tow my truck." Greg sighed and rubbed his temples. "I figured she'd try something like that." "Look, man, this whole thing is getting out of hand. Ever since that meeting, people have been calling nonstop, demanding answers. Some of the board members are talking about stepping down just to get away from the mess." I leaned against the counter. "Then why not do something about it?" "Margery's the problem. If you all turn on her, this whole thing ends." Greg hesitated. "She's got connections. The people who back her, they aren't afraid to make life difficult for anyone who crosses them." I scoffed. "She's already making life miserable for everyone. And after what she pulled with my Kennels, she's facing actual criminal charges. Do you really want to go down with her?" Greg exhaled, glancing around as if making sure no one else was listening. "There's going to be an emergency board meeting tomorrow night. Some of us are pushing for a vote to remove her as president." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. "Then push hard," I said, "because if she stays in power, this neighborhood is going to keep falling apart." Greg nodded, looking more resolved than I'd ever seen him. "I'll do what I can." That night, I made sure my security cameras were running at full capacity. I wouldn't put it past Margery to try something desperate. Sure enough, just after midnight, I caught movement near my fence. I pulled up the feed on my phone and saw a shadowy figure creeping along the perimeter. Margery. She was holding something in her hand, moving toward my kennels. I didn't waste time. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped onto my porch and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Margery froze like a deer caught in headlights. "Really?" I called out. "You just got cited for trespassing and you're already back at it." She didn't answer, just glared at me from the shadows. "Hope you like courtrooms," I continued, holding up my phone, "because this is all going straight to the police." Margery's expression twisted into something ugly, but she didn't say a word. Instead, she turned and stormed off into the night. I stayed outside for a while, making sure she didn't come back. Tomorrow's board meeting was going to be interesting. The night before the emergency board meeting, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, if anything, I was ready to watch Margery's downfall in real time, but I knew better than to assume she'd go down quietly. By the time the meeting rolled around, the community center was packed. More residents had shown up than I'd ever seen at one of these things, and the energy in the room was different. People weren't here out of obligation. They were here to make sure Margery was held accountable. She was already at the front, hands clasped tightly as she surveyed the crowd. Her usual smug confidence was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she had a stiff, forced composure, like she was barely keeping herself together. Greg, the board member who had hinted at the possible vote, cleared his throat and stood. "This meeting has been called to address recent concerns regarding the HOA's leadership," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Specifically, multiple complaints have been filed against the current president for overreach, selective enforcement, and legal violations." Margery shot to her feet. "This is a ridiculous ambush." Her voice was shrill as she pointed an accusing finger at Greg. "I have done nothing but enforce the rules that keep this community in order." Greg didn't flinch. "The issue isn't the rules," he replied evenly. The issue is how you've been using them, or rather, how you've been twisting them to target specific residents while ignoring infractions from others. A man from the back of the room spoke up. Like that time you let your friend build an extra-large shed in her yard, but you fined me for having a garden trellis. A woman near the front scoffed. Or how you tried to force Quentin to remove his kennels while your nephew parks his broken-down car on the street every day. More voices joined in. The floodgates had opened and Margery was drowning. Her eyes darted around, looking for support, but even her usual allies were shifting uncomfortably. "This is a coordinated attack against me," she snapped, her voice shaking now. "This man," she pointed at me, "has been undermining my authority for months. He's been stirring up resentment, spreading lies." I pushed off the wall where I'd been leaning. "Funny, since I haven't needed to spread anything," I said, my tone calm. "You did all this yourself." Her nostrils flared, but Greg spoke before she could lash out again. "As of now, the board will be voting on whether to remove Margery from her position as HOA president," he announced. "Per the bylaws, 5 votes are required for removal." Margery's expression twisted in fury. "You can't do this. I built this HOA." Greg ignored her and turned to the board members. "All in favor of removal." Hands began to rise. 1, 2, 3, 4, then after a tense moment the 5th hand went up. Margery let out a strangled noise, almost a gasp, almost a growl. "This is unbelievable," she shrieked. "You're all going to regret this." Greg didn't react. "Margery, as of this moment, you are no longer HOA president. You'll need to return any HOA property, including financial records and official documents, by the end of the week." Her eyes darted wildly around the room, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "You think you can just kick me out?" she spat. "I have connections." I tilted my head. "You have a court case pending against you," I reminded her. That shut her up real quick. She grabbed her purse off the table and stormed out, shoving past people on her way. The door slammed behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Then, slowly, someone clapped. It was Mrs. Donahue, the elderly lady who had shut her door in Margery's face days earlier. A few more people joined in until the whole room was applauding. Greg let out a breath. "Well," he said, rubbing his temples, "that was overdue." I couldn't help but agree, but something told me Margery wasn't done yet. The fallout from Margery's removal was immediate. The neighborhood's collective mood shifted overnight, like a storm had finally passed. People who had once been careful with their words now spoke freely. Conversations that had once been whispered were now open discussions on front lawns and driveways, but Margery wasn't gone, not completely. 2 days after the board's vote, I spotted her car creeping down the street like a shark circling its prey. She wasn't stopping at houses like before. No more clipboard, no more fabricated violations. But she was watching, waiting. That didn't sit right with me. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Greg stopped by that evening, looking more tired than I'd ever seen him. He leaned against the fence, watching Duke trot around the yard. "She still thinks she's in charge," Greg muttered. "I caught her trying to access the HOA's financial records this morning." "She doesn't have clearance anymore, but she's not giving up," I exhaled slowly. "What exactly was she trying to do?" Claiming she needed to check discrepancies, but we both know that's nonsense. She handled the finances herself for years. If there are discrepancies, they're because of her. That changed things. Margery was many things: controlling, manipulative, completely unhinged, but if she was desperate enough to go after financial records, it meant she had something to hide. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "A few of us started digging. There's money missing. Not a huge amount, but enough that it raises questions. Unauthorized expenses, weird withdrawals." I gave a low whistle. "So she wasn't just abusing power, she was stealing." Greg nodded grimly. "Looks that way." That explained her desperation. Losing her position wasn't just a blow to her ego, it was a threat to whatever scheme she had been running. I crossed my arms. "So what's the next move?" Greg hesitated. "We report it, but we need solid proof before we take it to the authorities." "A full audit. The board's handling it, but it's going to take time." Margery didn't have time. She was already acting like a cornered animal. The next morning, I woke to find a letter taped to my front door. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper with bold, angry handwriting. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with." No name, but it didn't need one. I took a photo, then called Greg. He wasn't surprised. "She's unraveling." "She's also getting sloppy," I pointed out. "Leaving threats on my door, that's not her usual style." Greg exhaled. "She's desperate. She knows we're closing in." I wasn't about to wait for Margery to make her next move. That evening, I set up additional security cameras, ones she wouldn't know about. If she wanted to lurk, she was going to get caught. It didn't take long. Just past midnight, movement near my driveway set off the alert on my phone. I pulled up the feed, and there she was, Margery, crouched near my trash bins, sifting through bags like a raccoon. I watched in disbelief as she pulled out a crumpled envelope and inspected it under her phone's flashlight. She was looking for something. Evidence, maybe? Something she thought she could use to regain control. I stepped outside, keeping my voice calm. "Find what you're looking for." Margery spun, eyes wild. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she straightened, brushing dirt off her sleeves like she hadn't just been digging through my garbage. "This neighborhood is falling apart without my leadership," she snapped. "You've turned everyone against me." I leaned against the porch railing. "No, Margery, you did that yourself." Her lips pressed together. "You don't belong here. You never did." That was the thing about people like her. They couldn't stand it when someone didn't bow to their authority. I tilted my head. "You can either walk away right now, or I can call the cops and add trespassing to your list of legal problems." Her hands clenched at her sides. For a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me. But then she let out a sharp breath and turned on her heel, storming off into the night. The next morning, Greg called with news. "The audit's done," he said. "Margery's been siphoning HOA funds for years. Fake maintenance fees, inflated invoices from companies that don't exist." "It's all there." I let out a low laugh. "So she wasn't just power-hungry, she was running a full-on scam." Greg's voice was tight. "We're handing everything over to the authorities today." By the end of the week, Margery was formally charged with embezzlement, fraud, and trespassing. It was over. The neighborhood moved on quickly. Without her iron grip, things improved. People started actually enjoying their homes again. The HOA, under new leadership, focused on real community improvements instead of pointless fines. As for me, I finally got some peace. Margery never showed her face again.